The sound didn't belong to that house. Miriam Caldwell had lived in the Rosedale property for 11 years, and she knew every noise it made. The particular groan of the third stair, the way the heating clicked twice before catching on cold mornings, the silence that gathered in her daughter's room like something that had decided to stay. She knew all of it. So when the laughter came drifting through the baby monitor at 20 past 11, on a Tuesday, later October, she didn't move at first. She sat at her desk, a glass of Bordeaux untouched beside the quarterly projections for Caldwell Meridian Capital, and she listened. It was Wren's laughter, unmistakably. The high, unguarded kind, the kind that a child can't fake, the kind Miriam hadn't heard in 2 years and 4 months. Her hand found the edge of the desk. On the monitor screen, the room was dark except for the hallway light bleeding under the door. The sound came again, not frightened, not crying, laughing, and beneath it, lower, she could hear something else. A voice, a man's voice, gentle and unhurried, doing something she couldn't quite make out. Miriam was already moving. She had built Caldwell Meridian from a second-hand desk in a Kensington Market apartment into one of the most closely watched mid-market investment firms in Toronto. The Globe had called her methodical and quietly formidable. Her competitors used other words. She was 41 years old, had read a balance sheet before she'd read a novel, and had learned early on that panic was simply information arriving faster than your framework could process it. She did not panic. But her hands were not entirely steady as she pulled up the security feed on her phone in the hallway. The system covered 12 points in and around the house. She'd installed it after the break-in attempt 2 winters ago, and she reviewed it maybe twice a year, usually when something felt off. She opened the backyard camera first. Nothing. The side gate, closed. The front drive, her car, the night nanny's sedan, and the old gray truck belonging to the groundskeeper she'd hired 6 weeks ago, still parked at the curb because he'd asked on his first day whether the truck might be a bother, and she'd told him to leave it. She switched to the indoor camera in the upstairs landing, and there he was. He was crouched just outside Wren's door, back against the wall, long legs folded beneath him, and he was holding his hands up in the hallway light in a way she didn't understand at first. Fingers spread, angled, casting something against the white wall opposite. A shape. It moved. It became the head of a dog, ears perked, then a rabbit mid-hop, then something with wings that circled once and landed. Wren's door was open 3 inches. From inside came the laughter again, soft and wondering and real. Miriam stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment without breathing. His name was Elliot Marsh. She knew that much from the hire. 44, according to the agency. A reference from a property in Oakville, another from a client in the Beach. No complaints, both references had said. Good with the hedges. Shows up when he says he will. What the agency had not told her, what she would learn only later, in ways that would dismantle and then rebuild something she hadn't known, was broken. Was anything else about him at all? She didn't ask him about it that night. She stood at the end of the upstairs hall until he heard her and turned, and she watched his expression go careful without going guilty. The way a person looks when they've been caught doing something they can't quite explain, but know wasn't wrong. She heard me come up the side path, he said, keeping his voice low. She was already at the door. I wasn't going to just walk past. How long has she been awake? 20 minutes, maybe. She wouldn't go back. I thought He glanced at the wall, the residue of whatever he'd been making. My daughter used to do the same thing. Couldn't sleep unless there was something to watch. Miriam looked at him for a moment, then she stepped past him into Wren's room. Wren was sitting up in bed, blanket pulled to her chin, watching the door. She was 7 years old and had not spoken a full sentence to anyone outside of her school therapist since the accident. She watched her mother cross the room, and she didn't pull away, which was its own kind of communication. Miriam sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed her hair back. Time to sleep, she said quietly. Wren looked past her toward the hallway. He'll be here tomorrow, Miriam said, though she had no particular reason to promise that. Wren lay down. The accident had happened in February, 28 months earlier, on the 401 just east of the Morningside interchange during a freezing rain event that shouldn't have caught anyone off guard because Environment Canada had issued the advisory 14 hours before. A transport truck carrying aggregate had jackknifed across 2 lanes. The car behind it had stopped in time. The car behind that one had not. Miriam's husband, David, had been driving. Ren had been in the back seat. David died at the scene. Ren had been pulled from the car by a passerby who stopped, a man who'd been driving the opposite direction, who had turned around when he saw the smoke and run across 4 lanes of iced highway in the dark and pulled a 7-year-old girl out of a vehicle that caught fire 11 seconds after he got her clear. Miriam had been in Vancouver presenting to a pension fund when her phone rang. The man who had pulled Ren from the car had sustained burns to his forearm and hand. He had spoken briefly to the paramedics, given his name and contact information, and then disappeared before the press arrived. Miriam had been told about him in the hospital by a police officer with tired eyes, and she had intended to find him. She had meant to. And then the grief had closed over everything like a door swinging shut, and Ren had stopped speaking, and the months began to move strangely, and she had not. She began watching the security feed the next morning, not obsessively. She had a company to run, quarterly reporting, a fund restructuring that had been absorbing her senior team for 3 months. A board dinner the following Thursday she would have canceled if she could have found the leverage. She watched the feed on her phone between calls, the way other people checked the news. Elliot worked Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. He arrived at 7:30, parked the gray truck with its one working rear signal light, let himself in through the side gate, and did what she'd hired him for. The beds along the back fence, the tree that had needed pruning since August, the pathstones that had heaved in the frost the previous winter. And at some point, every day he was there, Ren found him. Not in an intrusive way, not in a way that alarmed Miriam when she watched it back. Her daughter would simply appear in the kitchen doorway at the back of the house, watching through the glass. Elliot would eventually notice. She could tell from the slight change in how he moved, the way he didn't immediately look up, as though he understood that looking up too quickly would break something. He'd let her watch for a while. Then, when he did glance toward the house, he'd do something with his hands. A bird, a running horse, a fox with a curling tail, and Ren would press her palm flat against the glass. Miriam watched this on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in her office on the 32nd floor of a Bay Street tower, and felt something shift behind her sternum in a way she didn't have language for yet. She asked him about it on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the night in the hallway. She brought him coffee, which she'd never done before, and which she could tell registered. And she leaned against the fence post while he worked, and she said, "Where did you learn the shadow animals?" He took the coffee. He looked at it for a moment before answering. "My daughter went through a phase of not sleeping, about 4 years ago." He paused. Her mother we'd just separated. Neve was 5. She needed something to focus on that wasn't the dark. Did it work? Eventually. He drank the coffee. Most things do, eventually. Miriam looked out over the yard. The last of the October leaves had come down in the week's wind and lay across the grass in wet layers. "Ren hasn't spoken much since her father died," she said. She didn't know why she was telling him this. She told almost no one. She speaks to her therapist. She speaks to me a little. But She stopped. She was very verbal before. She used to narrate everything, every moment. She'd tell you exactly what she was thinking the second she thought it. Miriam looked at her hands. "I miss that." Elliot didn't say anything reassuring. He didn't say she'll get there, or kids are resilient, or any of the things people said. He just nodded, slowly, like someone receiving information they intended to hold carefully. That was when she first thought that there was something she didn't know about him. She ran his name through the firm's background service on a Monday evening, after Ren had gone to bed, sitting in the kitchen with the security feed open on one screen and Elliot Marsh on the other. What came back was not what she expected. Elliot Marsh, formerly chief attending in the trauma unit at St. Catherine's Regional, a mid-sized hospital east of the city, License suspended 18 months ago following a complaint filed with the College of Physicians and Surgeons. The complaint alleged procedural negligence in the treatment of two patients involved in a multi-vehicle accident on Highway 401, February of 2 years prior. Miriam read the date 3 times. The same accident. She opened the complaint file through a contact she had at a legal research firm. It took until Wednesday morning. The complaint was detailed, clinical, and devastating in tone. Dr. Marsh had been on duty when the accident victims were brought in. He had made a series of decisions that the complainant, filed on behalf of Caldwell Meridian Capital's corporate legal counsel, characterized as constituting a breach of standard of care. One patient had died before transfer. The complaint alleged Marsh's delays contributed. The patient who had died was not David. The complaint had been filed by her company's legal team. Acting, presumably, on behalf of company interests she had never sanctioned and had never been told about. She sat with this for a long time. Then she pulled the call logs from February of that year, not the firm's, but David's. She still had access to the joint account he'd used for personal expenses, had never closed it, in the particular way that grief sometimes expresses itself as administrative avoidance. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She found it in 20 minutes. 3 calls from a number registered to Caldwell Meridian's chief compliance officer, made in the 48 hours before the accident. David had been the firm's head of risk, technically her employee, practically her equal. Those calls should have been logged. They were not in any record she had been provided. She did not go to Elliot immediately. That would have been imprecise, and Miriam was not imprecise about things that mattered. She spent 2 weeks building the picture carefully. What she found was this. Caldwell Meridian had been carrying a liability exposure in its infrastructure fund, a transport company in which the firm held a significant position and which had a pending regulatory review of its fleet maintenance practices. The accident in February had been caused in part by a mechanical failure in the transport vehicle, a truck that belonged to a company in which her fund had invested. A failure that had been flagged in an internal audit 8 months before the accident and not acted upon. David had known. He had been pushing the compliance officer to disclose. She would later confirm through recovered emails, 3 days away from taking it to the outside board. And then there had been a freezing rain event on the 401. The medical complaint against Dr. Marsh had been filed within 6 weeks of the accident by a lawyer Miriam had never instructed and would never have instructed. It had been designed to redirect attention, to complicate the narrative around the accident, to ensure that if anyone looked at what had happened that night, they would find a story about a doctor's negligence rather than a transport company's maintenance records. Elliot Marsh had pulled her daughter from a burning car, sustained injuries doing it, and been thanked for it by having his career surgically removed. He had not once, in 6 weeks of showing up to her yard, mentioned any of this. She found him on a Thursday, earlier than he usually arrived, crouched by the back fence with a trowel, and she stood on the porch until he heard her and turned. "I know who you are," she said. He didn't look surprised. Not exactly. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a particular knock on a door for long enough that when it finally came, the sound of it was almost a relief. He stood. He set the trowel down. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You don't. Someone acting in my name destroyed your career. You are owed considerably more than an explanation." She came down the porch steps. "But I want to start there." He was quiet for a moment. The October light was thin and pale across the yard. Somewhere from the upper floor of the house she heard a small sound. Wren moving around in her room. "I didn't come here for that," he said. "I know. That's the part I'm still trying to understand. I heard she wasn't doing well." He paused. "A colleague of mine works near Wren's school. He mentioned it last year, not knowing the connection. He stopped. Looked at the fence. I think about that night. I think about it a great deal. I wanted to know she was all right." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. "She wasn't," she said, "until recently. What happened next took several months and was not graceful." Miriam began with the board. She had called an emergency session before she had fully decided how to handle it. which was unlike her. She was a person who generally decided how to handle things before she moved, but she had found that grief, when it finally moved through you towards something that looked like anger, didn't wait for your framework. She walked into the boardroom at Caldwell Meridian with a binder she had assembled herself, which was also unlike her, and she set it down on the table in front of the 6 people who had been running her company around her for 2 years. And she said, "I'd like to discuss the February liability." She watched their faces. 3 of them had known, 2 had known partially. One, the most senior, a man named Hartfield, who had been on the board since before she'd founded the firm, had known everything and had made the decision about the medical complaint personally, without her, as a measure he'd described in a contemporaneous email as necessary containment. She had printed that email on page 47 of the binder. She gave them time to read it. Then she said, "I'll be making a full voluntary disclosure to the OSC tomorrow morning. I've already spoken to outside counsel. Those of you who cooperate fully will receive consideration. Those who don't can speak with your own lawyers." She collected her binder. "I'd also suggest you not spend too much time coordinating your stories tonight. I've already spoken with Nathan." Nathan was the compliance officer. He had called her on a Sunday 3 days earlier and said, "I've been waiting for this call for 2 years, Miriam. What do you need from me?" She had needed quite a lot. The OSC investigation took 7 months. The media coverage was measured in column inches that stretched, Miriam was told by her PR firm, to something close to a record for a Canadian financial enforcement matter of its kind. She did not read most of it. She gave one interview to a journalist she trusted, and she said what was true. That she had not known, that she took responsibility for the culture that had made it possible not to know, and that the individuals responsible had been referred for full regulatory and potential criminal review. Hartfield resigned within the week. The transport company settled its fleet maintenance liability in a separate proceeding that took another 4 months and resulted in regulatory changes that her lawyers told her were more sweeping than anything passed in the sector in a decade. She wound down the infrastructure fund. She refunded the investors. She restructured what remained of Caldwell Meridian around a governance framework she wrote herself over 3 weekends in the kitchen while Wren colored at the table beside her. The complaint against Elliot's medical license was formally withdrawn by the college on a Thursday in late spring. His reinstatement took another 3 months. She did not tell him she had filed a supporting brief through her lawyers. She found out later he'd known anyway. His daughter's name was Neve, and she was 9 years old, and had her father's particular stillness and a streak of her own that expressed itself in a very precise, very relentless curiosity about how everything worked, how the camera focused, how the heating system knew what temperature you'd set, why the ice on the pond near the garden path was thicker at the edges than the middle. Wren found Neve fascinating for reasons that seemed to have nothing to do with talking. They met on a Saturday in early November, the November after everything, when Elliot brought Neve along because the sitter had canceled and he'd asked, a little awkwardly, whether it would be all right, and Miriam had said of course. She'd watched from the kitchen window as the 2 girls circled each other in the backyard with the careful assessment of children who have both learned, at some cost, that the world can change suddenly and without consultation. Neve had eventually crouched down and begun explaining something to Wren about the frost patterns on the garden stones. Wren had crouched too and listened, and after a while said something back. Miriam set down her coffee cup. She stood very still. Wren said something else. Then both girls were lying flat on the cold ground with their faces close to the stones, examining whatever it was Neve had found. Elliot came to stand beside her at the window. He'd come in for the coffee she'd left out, and now they were both just standing there, watching. "She talks to her," Miriam said. "I noticed." "She hasn't." Miriam stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment. "She did a full paragraph in speech therapy last week. Her therapist called me. She said Wren had described a shadow rabbit in detail. She wanted to know if I knew what she was referring to." He was quiet. Outside, Neve was pointing at something at the far edge of the garden path, and Wren was following her pointing finger with the focused expression she'd had since infancy, when she'd been the kind of child who tracked light sources across ceilings. I know what it cost you, Miriam said. What was done to you? I know I can't. You didn't do it. My company did. My name is on the company. You're also the person who blew it open. Those aren't the same thing. He paused. I spent a long time being angry at the wrong target. I'm trying not to repeat that. She turned to look at him then. He was still watching his daughter through the glass. I don't want to be a debt you're repaying, he said. If that makes sense. It does, she said. I'm not trying to. She stopped again. She was not, as a rule, a person who ran short on words, but something about him made her careful with them. I just want to know if you'd like to stay for lunch. The quiet that followed was a different kind of quiet than the kind she'd grown used to. Yeah, he said. We'd like that. There is a moment in some houses, on certain Saturday mornings, when the light comes through the east windows at a particular angle and catches the steam from 2 mugs of coffee on a kitchen table, and the sound from another room is children's voices, arguing maybe, or explaining things, or doing the running commentary that children do when they're at ease, and the person sitting at the table does not look at their phone. Miriam looked at the frost on the garden path, and the shadow the old oak threw across it, and the way the 2 pairs of small boots were lined up at the back door, haphazard and overlapping. She thought about David. She thought about him the way she'd been learning to, not as a door that had swung shut, but as the reason she knew what a house full of noise was worth. Wren came running in from the hallway, sock-footed, and said, Neve says the ice is thicker where the water can't move. Is that real? It is, Miriam said. Why? Come here, I'll show you. Wren climbed onto the chair beside her, and Miriam pulled a napkin across the table and started to draw water molecules, the way they slow and order themselves in cold, the structure that becomes ice, and Wren watched with her chin in her hand, and outside the kitchen window, the frost sat in its patterns on the garden stones, doing exactly what Neve had said it was doing, following rules that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be noticed.